While the federal government continues to say take the first COVID-19 vaccine shot you're offered, Ontario has joined Alberta in suspending the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine for concerns over blood clotting. To talk about this in more detail is one of our regular contributors, Brian Lilley from the Toronto Sun. Brian, what really changed their minds? I thought the blood clots were extremely rare.
They are still extremely rare, but they've become less rare. So the Ontario data, originally it was 1 in 1 million. Then it became 1 in 125,000. And now it's about 1 in every 60,000. And even though we've only had 8 of these VITT, which essentially comes out to blood clotting, the officials said, you know what? Let's suspend using it for first doses. Now, Alberta, well, they actually say it's just about supply, but they're going to get more supply eventually. But they've said, you know what, we're just going to use the Pfizer and Moderna, and if we ever get it, the Johnson and Johnson. I think that blood clotting is part of that, and I think you'll see more provinces step forward and say we're not going to do this anymore. So. You know, we're looking at about 650,000 doses, I hear, could be available by the end of the month across the country, and then 1 million in June. But I just don't see those being used except for second doses because, you know, roughly 2 million people have got them and they may want to stay the course. Although even that right now, Hal, is up in the air.
Well, I wanted to ask you, so the 2 million Canadians who received the original shot of the AstraZeneca vaccine, what's going to happen with them? Are they going to come back and say, you know what, I'm going to hold off. Maybe I'm going to go with the Moderna or the Pfizer when it comes to my second shot?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people looking for information out of a UK study on mixing and matching. And at this point, I will say that I'm glad I did not get the AstraZeneca vaccine. I still think that it would be safe for me. I still would get 2 doses of it if I could. But since it doesn't look like that, and since it looks like the federal government and the provinces are going to start saying, you know what, your second dose, you're getting Pfizer or Moderna, I don't like the idea of mixing and matching. And they might tell me it's safe, but hey, they said there were no problems taking AstraZeneca before. These guys keep changing their minds. It's not going to help with vaccine hesitancy. And that's important because, you know, as we'll talk about in a moment, the PM says, got to get a whole bunch of you vaccinated before we can do anything else. So, you know, I think there's going to continue to be confusion. I know a lot of people who got the AZ shot, people my age, in their 40s, they're happy they did, but I'm sure I've spoken to others who now have a bit of buyer's remorse at being told you got the inferior one and we're not using it anymore.
Well, I know in some of the health officials in China, they said, just kind of mix them all in together and then you're definitely covered. Just throw them all in together, you know? We'll see what happens.
No thanks, no thanks.
Now, Brian, with the new provincial health restrictions, attendance at churches in Alberta here is down to 15 people, 10 for funeral homes, funeral services. Outdoor patios have been shut down at restaurants. You know, many are not happy about it. In Ontario, there's been a stay-at-home order for about a month, which is supposed to end, I believe, on May 20th. But will it?
No, it's going to be extended. There's no doubt about that right now. And it's not just case counts. You know, I know some people are constantly yelling at me, the case counts are amplified, the PCR threshold is too high, this is a scamdemic. What you can't be faked is the fact that there are people in hospitals and ICUs, and that's what's really driving the desire to keep things closed. Do we have to keep everything closed? I think there's a solid argument and evidence that says this is not the only way to deal with it, but it is the overwhelming way that provincial governments across the country have chosen to deal with it. And Ontario has locked down more than BC, more than Alberta, more than Saskatchewan. It's a debate about whether Ontario or Quebec has the strictest lockdowns, but the public tend to support them here, unlike in Alberta. So yeah, we're at the situation where religious services are severely restricted, but plane loads of people flying across the country or in from outside of the country, that's just fine. And in those situations, you're cheek to jowl with each other, never mind being restricted to 10 or 15. But don't worry, Hal, it's all based on science. So no golfing in Ontario, no school for in-person learning for the foreseeable future in Ontario, probably at-home virtual learning until next September.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up. Here in Alberta, of course, Premier Kenney says some of the restrictions, including at-home learning from K through grade 12, will continue until after the May long weekend. How are Ontarians handling the lockdown restrictions there? I know here, anxiety and depression rates are going through the roof.
I was just looking at a Maru public opinion research survey, and they asked people, they gave them 11 positive and 11 negative feelings and said, which ones most match you? And the top three were frustrated, anxious, and bored. So that was one, two, and three. And those were more than 35, about 36 to 39% of the population said, this matches my mood. The first positive feeling was tied at number four, and that was, I feel fortunate. So people that have jobs that say, well, I still feel fortunate. I'm lucky I have a job. As many of us do not have jobs anymore across the country. We all know some people in that situation. But right behind that was, isolated. People are feeling isolated. 35% of the population saying that, you know, this is, regardless of where you are in the country, you know, we are social beings, we are social creatures, and that being cut off hurts everyone. There was another survey just recently saying that 47% of mothers with children at home are at the breaking point. Um, Eventually something will have to give. Thankfully, the weather's getting better. We're able to get outside. Maybe you can't play golf. Maybe you can't play tennis, at least here in Ontario, but you can get outside and see a bit of sunshine, breathe in a bit of fresh air.
Alberta's Justice Minister Casey Medu says the restrictions were needed to help stop the spike here in the province. He says if the Kenney government didn't bring in the new restrictions, Brian, then hospitals would be overrun, which is what Ottawa would have wanted. He not only said Ottawa, but the official opposition, Rachel Notley, and the NDP, and as well mainstream media. But when it comes to Ottawa, has Prime Minister Justin Trudeau responded to that comment from our Justice Minister Casey Medu?
He rejects the idea that the federal government is hoping for Alberta to fail, that the media or others are hoping for Alberta to fail. I can't say that I disagree with him. I'm not going to agree with everything Casey Medu said in his statement, but there is an inordinate amount of attention paid to Ontario and Alberta, especially when things start going badly. When things are going well, the national media does not pay attention. But when these two provinces, led by strong, well-known conservatives, are, you know, dealing with the worst parts of COVID, when they're struggling, then it becomes an all-out assault. So if Casey Medu is feeling like everyone's out to get him, it doesn't make him paranoid. It makes him tuned into what's happening.
Now, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also says COVID-19 restrictions must remain in place, Brian, until at least 75% of Canadians get their first shot. Then he says we can have a one-shot summer. What exactly is a one-shot summer? And doesn't that kind of go against what the provinces are planning on?
One-shot summer, it sounds an awful lot like a Bananarama song from the 80s called Cruel Summer. You know, if these restrictions have to stay in place until 75% of us have the vaccine, I can tell you here in Ontario, and it's roughly the same, they're all within a few points of each other. Here in Ontario, we're about to cross over, or have just crossed over today, 50% of the adults 18 and over having at least one shot. We've got to get another 25%. If restrictions have to stay in place for that long, then the stay-at-home order in Ontario is going to be in place far beyond the projected date of freedom that I had suggested, which was June 3rd. It will be extended past that. I know some doctors are already advising the Ford government to extend the stay-at-home order into July and August. That's the way some public health officials view this. But the PM says this and expects that the provinces will follow his wishes. An hour after he says this, or an hour or two, Francois Legault, the Premier of Quebec, comes out and announces, well, we're going to resume in-person learning and we're going to open up retail and we're loosening restrictions. If that had been Doug Ford or Jason Kenney, to go back to my earlier comments, especially around Casey Medu, there would have been a national media uproar. Quebec can do what Quebec wants, and Quebec can have the worst death rate in the first and second waves, and nobody's caring, nobody's noticing, and you know it's all fine. Anything that Alberta and Ontario do gets far more scrutiny, including from the national media and the PM.
Brian, you talked about hitting the links earlier. Let's go back and chat about golf once again. Millions of Canadians love playing golf. I mean, it's good exercise, fresh air, players are able to physically distance. Why are golf courses such a big issue where you are in Ontario when it comes to the COVID-19 crisis?
Because we have a stay-at-home order, and they've shut down schools. And so the lines that the government will give you when you ask them about this is, how does it make sense to have a stay-at-home order to close the outdoor recreational activities, including basketball courts, and then say, but you know what? If you golf, just fine, book a tee time. They want people to stay home. And think of the message that it would send that they've locked off, municipalities have locked off basketball courts, taken down beach volleyball nets, but you got a bunch of well-to-do old guys out golfing. That would send exactly the wrong message. Beyond that, Dr. David Williams, the chief medical officer here, has said that it's not necessarily always the activity, it's the travel to get to the activity, and it's what people do around it, like gathering at the trunk of the car at the end for a beer because the 19th hole is closed. So you all gather around the car, nobody has the masks on, nobody's social distancing anymore, and you're having the beer. They said that's what happened, and we had some super spreader hockey events go on back in the winter. That's what happened then. They don't want that happening now. I'll tell you how. The golfers have been the most adamant group that they must be allowed to play. They are the most vocal group of any organization, any group of people I've dealt with during this pandemic, second only to teachers. And I think, I've been speaking out against all of these closures, businesses being shut down, people being thrown out of work, and none of these people spoke up. Suddenly you take their tea time away, and it's like the world has ended. If they were willing to speak up for the small businesses being oppressed, I'd be fine with it. But I'm really actually getting annoyed that these people were silent during that time. They were fine with all the lockdown restrictions until you took away their tea time. If losing a tea time is the worst thing that's happened to you in this pandemic, you ain't suffering.
Brian, there's a big fight brewing between the Canadian government and the governor of Michigan, and it involves a pipeline. Michigan is trying to shut down Enbridge's Line 5 pipeline. Now, that would not only hurt Alberta, but also you in Ontario.
I think it's 40 to 50%, or is it higher, of all the jet fuel used at Pearson comes via Line 5. So it comes into Sarnia, Ontario, where it is processed and turned into jet fuel and then trucked onto the airport. So if this shuts down, the airplanes may shut down, or they'll have to find a new way to get the jet fuel processed in Sarnia. Maybe they'll be sending it by rail. Governor Whitmer in Michigan just really doesn't want this pipeline to go forward, which is strange because other parts of her government have been giving approvals for replacing certain parts of the pipeline that runs under the Straits of Mackinac. The pipeline spends most of its time in Canada, but in order to get to southern Ontario, southwestern Ontario, it cuts under the Straits of Mackinac, goes across Michigan, and then into Ontario that way. It's a bit of a shortcut. The governor, they've passed this shutdown order. They're not enforcing it. But if this is upheld, if it's, mediation doesn't work, if the 1977 Pipelines Treaty is not invoked, if the Biden administration doesn't step in, then yeah, we are in for a lot of trouble here in Ontario and even out toward parts of Quebec. It's a good thing that it's not winter because an awful lot of people, especially in rural areas, still heat their homes with propane and with oil, both of which are products that are, the oil that comes through the pipeline is broken down into those, the home heating oil and propane. So it's lucky this is happening in summer and we might have a bit more wiggle room.
Brian, the fight over Bill C-10, which is being dubbed as the Internet Censorship Bill, continues. There's been a lot of opposition to it. Have the Trudeau Liberals backed down at all?
Not really. They have and they haven't. So they're still defending this bill and saying this has to go forward, and they maintain that it will not end up, having the government curating your social media feeds or regulating Granny's cat videos or even the, a successful YouTube or the things like that. But they're also saying that, yes, if you are getting a lot of traffic on a platform like YouTube, then you should be regulated. So someone that's just making videos at home and posting them to YouTube, and because they're popular, now you're going to be treated like CTV or CBC or Global, the big broadcasters, or like you. I mean, you've dealt with the CRTC most of your career. It can be a heavy hand. So they've agreed to do what's called a, check the constitutionality of the bill with some experts and hear from some other witnesses. But they are still determined to see this bill passed and passed quickly. I think the whole thing has to be scrapped.
Toronto Sun columnist and one of our regular contributors, Brian Lilley, thanks again for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.